It goes back as early, the earliest civilization that historians identify is the Sumerian civilization, and they have a story of the flood. This is something that I think has to be explained, and one way that people typically explain it is they just write it off as, myth, ancient myth. But personally, I'm not willing to go there. I think that the ancients did have a lot of myths, obviously, but we can't just write off everything that they say because they had some myths in their civilizations. Does that make sense? I mean, they were human beings as well, right? And as human beings, what that means is that, they probably also share the same desire that we do to record significant events, right? And so if we find, an event that is recorded by all of Earth's civilizations and the historical record, I mean, we ought to take this very seriously. And one of them is the flood, the Great Flood, in which just a few people survived. So, is this a detail of the history of humanity that Christianity incorporated into its tradition, and further back before Christianity, that Judaism incorporated into its tradition? Well, the answer is yes. So it's certainly not exclusively a Christian idea or teaching, or exclusively, Jewish or something like that. So that's something that we have to keep in mind. So again, we're talking about catastrophism as an alternative to uniformitarianism. Now, it has been suggested by scientists, a minority of scientists, obviously, because it's not the predominant view. But it has been suggested by scientists that catastrophism can actually account for changes in the rates, the geological rates that we measure today. So it would have had a great effect on, say, the shifting of the plates, the tectonic plates. It would have a great effect on the rates of radioactive decay in rocks. So there's things that we have to take into account if we're going to be responsible with history. You have to be responsible with the philosophical assumptions which underlie our science. And now, obviously, I'm explaining something to you that is not the predominant view, and just by virtue of it being a minority view, a lot of people are just going to write it off, immediately dismiss it, and what do I have to say about that? I think we should just keep in mind that in history there was a time when the predominant view was, when evolution and the what was the beginning of the modern scientific narrative, there was a time when that was the minority view. So keep that in mind, because as time goes by, things change. And just because I don't like using that phrase, but because something is a particular view is not the majority view, doesn't necessarily mean that it's wrong. And we have this strong tendency in our society to immediately dismiss anything that is not the majority view. So treat that how you like. I'm just making some points about this, and you can do with that what you will. Alright, so we talked about the historical narratives, we talked about the modern scientific narrative. We didn't really talk about it too much. Obviously, it's, evolution is a predominant view, macroevolution, that life eventually over millions of years, evolved into from simple organisms to complex organisms, and eventually into, what we are today. And this is viewed by some people as a, simply physical process. There are religious people who, think that the divine had something to do with this, and so they'll accept evolution and they'll accept their religion. As you know, I don't have to tell you all this. Alright, so let me just ask you guys, which of these views really has authority? Alright, so do the scientists today really have authority to tell us about our origins and where we came from? Well, that's kind of a complex question, right? I mean, what does it mean to have authority? Well, it means that you actually know something and you're in the position of being able to accurately and responsibly divulge that to the population. Now, modern scientists, they have the geological record, and they form that record in a certain way, and they have evidence. They have these skulls. We've all seen the skulls. They look nothing like us. They're still looking for the missing link, obviously. I think one thing we can all agree on is that on the modern scientific view, we're dealing with a very long period of time, and none of us were there to see these events. Okay, we didn't witness them, so all we can do is look at the record. Now, there's many anomalies in the record. You've got the Cambrian explosion, which scientists have a very hard time explaining on the modern view, the modern scientific view. And you've got a lot of other anomalies as well, and we don't have time to get into them all, but we're just trying to touch on some subjects, give you something to think about, okay? Authority, though, is a subject which I'm not going to delve into completely in this video, because authority is a very, very important issue, and it's one which I want to dedicate another video entirely to. Okay, so we're going to be talking about authority. So think about it. The question of authority is a very important one. Think about it, and we're going to come back to it. All right. So the last thing we're going to talk about, though, with this edition is explanatory power. Right? So how much explanatory power does the modern scientific narrative, how much explanatory power does the modern scientific narrative have, and how much explanatory power does the Christian narrative have? And is there a reliable measure of explanatory power? Well, I'm not sure. I think for me it's just kind of like how the narrative, how it strikes me, how reliable it strikes me, how does it seem to make sense of what we see and of our experience and all of that sort of thing. And obviously people are gonna debate this. I mean, it's always been debated, since Darwin, maybe even a little before, and it's always going to be debated. So we're not going to come to a consensus with me and all of the viewers out there, but anyway, we can talk about it, and hopefully just discussing it and talking about it will help us, have more to consider and kind of like get on the same train of thought so that we can see what each other are thinking, and what Christians are thinking, what agnostics are thinking, and so forth. Well, the question I really want to ask is, I mean, you can deal with evolution on your own, and whether that has a lot of explanatory power to you. Um, for me personally, I think that evolution does have explanatory power. I do not accept it because I do not think that every view that has explanatory power is an accurate one, right? So, in other words, when people lie, okay, and when people lie, what do? Well, they try to come up with a narrative which has a lot of explanatory power, right? Which explains the situation, right? And a lot of times, people come up with very convincing lies, and so a well-formed lie is something which we would expect to have a lot of explanatory power,